The flight that changed everything. The day was already off to a rough start for Mia Carter. She had woken up at dawn to prepare for a cross-country flight with her 6-year-old son, Oliver. Travel was never easy for Oliver. He was autistic, and the bustling, noisy environment of airports often overwhelmed him. Still, Mia had planned every detail meticulously: noise-canceling headphones, his favorite sensory toys, snacks he loved, and even his well-worn blanket that brought him comfort. Despite her careful preparation, Mia couldn't shake the nervous tension building in her chest. The airport was a cacophony of sounds and sights. Mia held Oliver's hand tightly as they navigated through the crowd, his small fingers gripping hers for dear life. He clutched his toy dinosaur in the other hand, rubbing its textured surface as a way to self-soothe. Mia kept whispering reassurances to him, hoping her calm tone could anchor him amidst the chaos. At the check-in counter, the airline staff seemed rushed but polite. Mia explained that her son had autism and asked if they could pre-board to settle in before the general boarding rush. The attendant nodded and marked their tickets, but Mia noticed the faint flicker of annoyance on the woman's face. She chose to ignore it, focusing instead on getting Oliver through security without a meltdown. The TSA checkpoint proved more challenging. The sensory overload of flashing lights, loud voices, and strangers giving abrupt instructions made Oliver visibly anxious. He began humming softly, a coping mechanism that Mia recognized instantly. A TSA agent raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the sound, but said nothing as Mia whispered soothing words to Oliver. After what felt like an eternity, they were finally through. By the time they reached the gate, Mia was exhausted, but Oliver was still visibly on edge. The boarding announcement crackled through the intercom, and Mia gratefully accepted the early boarding privilege. They made their way onto the plane, where Mia quickly settled Oliver into the window seat, buckling his seatbelt and arranging his blanket and headphones. The cabin was quiet for now, but Mia knew the peace wouldn't last. Passengers began filing in, their chatter and the thuds of overhead bins opening and closing creating a symphony of noise that grated on Oliver's already frayed nerves. He started tapping his fingers rhythmically on the armrest, his humming growing louder. Mia gently reminded him to keep his headphones on and handed him his dinosaur, hoping to distract him. Just as Mia was starting to think they might get through the flight unscathed, a flight attendant approached their row. Her uniform was crisp, her expression sharp, and her demeanor exuded efficiency. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began, her tone curt, "we need to ensure the cabin remains a comfortable environment for everyone. Could you please make sure your child keeps it down?" Mia looked up, startled. "He's doing his best," she explained, keeping her voice calm. "Oliver has autism, and new environments can be challenging for him. I'm trying to help him settle." The flight attendant's expression didn't soften. If anything, her frown deepened. "I understand, but other passengers are trying to rest. This kind of disruption isn't fair to them." Mia felt her heart drop. She glanced around, noticing a few passengers already casting judgmental glances their way. Oliver's humming had grown louder, his discomfort evident. Mia leaned closer to her son, whispering reassuringly, but the tension in her own voice betrayed her frustration. "I'm sorry," Mia said, trying to keep her composure. "We're doing everything we can. He's just overwhelmed." The flight attendant sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, if you can't manage your child's behavior, we may have to move you to a different section of the plane." Mia's stomach twisted. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not just from embarrassment, but from anger. How could this woman be so dismissive? She wanted to argue, to explain that Oliver wasn't being disruptive on purpose, but she knew it would only escalate the situation. Instead, she turned her focus back to her son, who was now holding his ears and rocking slightly, trying to block out the noise. The flight attendant huffed and walked away, muttering something under her breath that Mia couldn't quite catch. Tears pricked at the corners of Mia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to stay strong for Oliver. As the plane continued to board, Mia noticed the flight attendant speaking with another member of the crew. Both of them glanced toward her row, their expressions unreadable. Mia felt like a spotlight was on her and Oliver, as if they were the main attraction in some cruel, judgmental show. Finally, the cabin doors closed, and the plane began taxiing down the runway. Oliver's anxiety had reached its peak. He started to vocalize, his voice rising in pitch as he clutched his dinosaur tighter. Mia leaned in, trying to calm him, but the confined space and the mounting pressure were too much for him. From her peripheral vision, Mia saw the same flight attendant approaching again, her expression hardening as she neared their row. "Ma'am, I've already spoken to you about this," the flight attendant said, her voice low but firm. "If you can't keep your child under control, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." Mia felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. "He's not trying to cause trouble," she said, her voice trembling. "He has autism. He doesn't understand." "I understand plenty," the flight attendant interrupted, crossing her arms. "And I understand that this isn't acceptable. Everyone else on this plane has managed to keep their children quiet." Mia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice from a few rows ahead interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" The cabin fell silent. All eyes turned toward the man standing in the aisle, his tall frame and commanding presence instantly drawing attention. He wore a tailored suit and had an air of authority that made even the flight attendant pause. Mia couldn't see his face clearly, but something about the way he carried himself felt different, important. The flight attendant straightened, her tone softening as she addressed him. "Sir, I was just speaking with this passenger about the noise." "That passenger," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "is the reason this flight exists." The flight attendant blinked, clearly confused. "Excuse me." The man turned, his gaze landing on Mia and Oliver. When Maya finally met his eyes, she saw something she hadn't encountered from anyone else on that flight. Understanding. A quiet revelation. The man in the tailored suit stepped closer, his presence commanding attention from everyone nearby. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the cabin moments before. Maya looked up at him, her heart pounding. Who was he? And why was he intervening now? The flight attendant, visibly caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at the other crew members for support, but they stayed frozen, unsure of how to respond. "Sir," the flight attendant began, her voice wavering, "I was just trying to..." "To what?" The man interrupted, his tone sharp but measured. "To address a situation you clearly don't understand." His gaze moved to Mia, softening. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Mia blinked, stunned by the sudden attention. I'm fine," she managed to say, though her voice trembled. "It's my son. He has autism. He's struggling with the noise and the environment." The man nodded, his expression kind but firm. He turned back to the flight attendant, his voice low but cutting. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" The flight attendant stammered, clearly flustered. I wasn't aware, sir. I was just trying to maintain order in the cabin." "Order?" the man repeated, his tone incredulous. "By singling out a child with special needs and berating his mother. That's your idea of order?" The silence in the cabin was deafening. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Mia felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but for once, she didn't feel judged. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. Someone was finally standing up for her and Oliver. "I'm sorry, sir," the flight attendant said, her face reddening. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to." The man interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Do you know who owns this plane?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. The flight attendant's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at her colleagues. Mia's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? The man turned back to Mia, his expression softening again. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I'm sorry you've had to endure this treatment. My name is Daniel Reynolds. I work directly for your family's company." Mia's jaw dropped. "My family's company?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. This plane, along with several others in the fleet, is part of your father's aviation portfolio. I'm here to ensure that all flights run smoothly and that passengers, especially you and your son, are treated with the utmost respect." The color drained from the flight attendant's face. She stepped back, her hands fidgeting nervously. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize because you didn't bother to listen," Daniel said sharply. "You saw a situation that didn't fit your rigid expectations, and instead of showing empathy, you chose to escalate it." Mia was still reeling from the revelation. Her father, Robert Carter, was a prominent businessman, but she had always distanced herself from his wealth and influence. She preferred to live a quieter life, focused on raising Oliver and advocating for children with special needs. She rarely traveled on her family's private jets, opting instead for commercial flights to avoid the complications of her father's world. But now, that world had come crashing into hers. "Mrs. Carter," Daniel continued, "I'm deeply sorry for the way you've been treated. I assure you this behavior does not reflect our company's values or standards. I'll be addressing this matter with the crew personally." Mia swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to accept his apology and move on, but another part of her, the part that had fought so hard for Oliver every day, refused to let this moment pass without making a point. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice steadier now. "I appreciate your intervention, but this isn't just about me or my family. This is about a lack of understanding, a lack of training. My son isn't disruptive, he's overwhelmed. And instead of helping us, this crew made us feel like we didn't belong." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "You're absolutely right, ma'am, and I assure you, steps will be taken to ensure this never happens again." He turned to the flight attendant, who was now visibly trembling. "Apologize," he said simply. The flight attendant's voice cracked as she spoke. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to cause you or your son any distress." Mia stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you. But an apology isn't enough. This is about awareness, understanding, compassion. It's about creating an environment where children like my son are accepted, not ostracized." "I understand," the flight attendant murmured, her eyes downcast. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Mia's shoulder. "Mrs. Carter, I'll make sure this incident is reported to the highest levels. But more importantly, I'd like to work with you on improving our staff training programs. Your perspective as a parent and advocate is invaluable." Mia felt a flicker of hope. For the first time that day, it seemed like real change might be possible. "I'd be happy to help," she said, her voice firm. As Daniel escorted the flight attendant away to address the matter further, Mia turned back to Oliver. He had calmed down significantly, his fingers still gripping his toy dinosaur. She reached over and stroked his hair, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. We're okay." For the rest of the flight, the crew's attitude shifted dramatically. Flight attendants brought Mia and Oliver drinks and snacks, offering assistance at every turn. Passengers who had initially cast judgmental glances now looked on with a mix of curiosity and admiration. By the time the plane touched down, Mia felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one incident on one flight. It was about changing the narrative for families like hers. She resolved to use her voice, her experience, and yes, even her family's influence, to push for a world where children like Oliver were seen, heard, and respected. As she stepped off the plane with Oliver in her arms, she knew this was only the beginning. The storm after the landing. As Mia and Oliver walked into the bustling terminal, the bright lights and hum of the crowd reminded her that the world outside was just as chaotic as the flight had been. But this time, she felt different. Her encounter with Daniel Reynolds and the sudden revelation about her family's connection to the airline gave her a new sense of agency. Still, the emotions from the incident lingered, threatening to overwhelm her. Oliver clung to her side, his fingers gripping her jacket tightly. He was visibly calmer now, but Mia knew how fragile his peace could be. The familiar texture of his toy dinosaur and the predictable rhythm of walking seemed to ground him. She guided him toward the baggage claim, keeping her steps steady and deliberate. As they approached the carousel, Daniel caught up with them, his stride purposeful but not hurried. His presence was both comforting and intimidating. A man used to handling high-stakes situations, now focused entirely on Mia and Oliver. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, falling into step beside her, "I wanted to ensure you were settling in and see if there's anything I can assist with now that we've landed." Mia appreciated his effort but felt a pang of skepticism. Was this genuine concern, or was it damage control? "We're fine for now, thank you," she said, her tone polite but reserved. Daniel nodded, sensing her guarded response. "I understand this has been a challenging experience for you. I'll be filing a full report with the airline's leadership team, but I'd also like to propose something more proactive." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Proactive? What do you mean?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "You brought up an excellent point on the plane about awareness and training. If you're willing, I'd like to arrange a meeting between you and the executives who oversee our training programs. Your first-hand perspective could be invaluable in helping us develop more effective protocols." Mia hesitated. The offer sounded promising, but she wasn't sure if it was just a way to appease her after the incident. She wanted real change, not just a corporate gesture. Still, the opportunity to speak directly to decision-makers was rare, and she knew she couldn't pass it up. "I'll consider it," she said cautiously. "But I want to make it clear, this isn't about me or my family's connection to the airline. It's about making things better for every family dealing with autism or other special needs." Daniel smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his otherwise professional demeanor. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Carter. I'll have my assistant reach out to schedule a time that works for you." As they reached the carousel, Oliver spotted their suitcase and pointed excitedly. "There it is, Monty," he said, his voice filled with relief. Mia smiled and retrieved the bag, grateful for the small moment of normalcy. She turned back to Daniel. "Thank you for stepping in earlier. I appreciate your help, but I also need to process everything before I commit to anything." "Of course," Daniel said with a nod. "Take your time. And if there's anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out." With that, he walked away, leaving Mia and Oliver to navigate the next steps on their own. As they exited the airport and hailed a cab, Mia's thoughts churned. The offer to collaborate on training programs was a step in the right direction, but was it enough? Could she trust the airline to follow through? A quiet evening, a loud mind. Later that evening, after settling Oliver into bed, Mia sat alone in her living room. The events of the day played on a loop in her mind: the judgmental stares, the flight attendant's harsh words, and the moment Daniel revealed the truth about the plane's ownership. Her initial shock had given way to a simmering anger. How many other families had faced similar treatment without someone stepping in to help? Mia opened her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her face in the dimly lit room. She typed "autism air travel experiences" into the search bar and hit enter. The results were overwhelming. Stories from parents flooded the screen. Tales of children being removed from flights, families being humiliated in front of strangers, and airline staff failing to show even a basic level of understanding. She clicked on one story, her heart sinking as she read about a mother whose son had been denied boarding because he was having a meltdown in the terminal. The mother had tried to explain his condition, but the staff had refused to listen. Instead, they had labeled him a disruptive passenger and barred them from the flight. Mia felt a wave of empathy and anger. This wasn't just her fight. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. She began drafting an email, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She outlined her own experience, emphasizing the need for comprehensive training and systemic changes within the airline industry. She included links to resources from autism advocacy groups and studies highlighting the importance of empathy and understanding in customer service roles. When she finished, she stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The email wasn't just a complaint, it was a call to action. With a deep breath, she hit send. The ripple effect. The next morning, Mia woke to find her inbox flooded with responses. Her email had made its way to advocacy groups, parents, and even a few journalists who were eager to share her story. One email, in particular, stood out. It was from a representative of a national autism advocacy organization. Dear Mrs. Carter, thank you for sharing your story. We've been working on similar initiatives to address the challenges families face when traveling with children on the autism spectrum. Your experience highlights the urgent need for systemic change. We'd love to collaborate with you to amplify this issue and push for industry-wide reforms. Mia's heart raced as she read the message. She replied immediately, expressing her interest in working together. Within hours, a plan was in motion. The advocacy group offered to help her prepare for the meeting with the airline executives, providing data, case studies, and expert advice. A mother's determination. As the week progressed, Maya found herself juggling the demands of motherhood with the newfound role of an advocate. Every free moment was spent on research, phone calls, and emails. She spoke with other parents, listened to their stories, and took detailed notes. She wanted to ensure that when she walked into that meeting, she would represent not just herself, but an entire community. Oliver, sensing his mother's focus, often sat beside her with his dinosaur, quietly playing while she worked. Mia made sure to take breaks, showering him with hugs and attention to remind him that, no matter what, he was her top priority. By the end of the week, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for Oliver. She was fighting for every child who had ever been misunderstood, for every parent who had felt helpless in the face of judgment. As she prepared for the upcoming meeting, Maya looked at Oliver, who was drawing on a piece of paper at the kitchen table. His innocence, his resilience, and his unique way of seeing the world fueled her determination. "We're going to make a difference, buddy," she said softly, more to herself than to him. This is just the beginning. Meeting the board. The day of the meeting arrived faster than Mia expected. Dressed in a professional yet simple outfit, she packed her notes, reports, and a tablet filled with data. Her heart thudded with nervous energy. But she was resolute. Today wasn't just about addressing her experience. It was about demanding real change. Oliver stayed home with a trusted friend, and while she kissed him goodbye, his simple words bolstered her resolve. "You're my hero, Mommy." As Mia stepped into the sleek office building where the airline's corporate headquarters was located, she felt the weight of her mission pressing down on her. The glass walls and polished marble floors reflected an intimidating world, one she rarely ventured into. But this time, she wasn't just Mia Carter, a mother of a child with autism. She was an advocate, a voice for countless families. Daniel Reynolds greeted her in the lobby, his demeanor professional yet friendly. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming. The board is eager to hear from you." Mia nodded, gripping her bag tightly. "I hope they're as eager to take action as they are to listen." Daniel smiled faintly, sensing her determination. "Let's make sure they are." Entering the lion's den. The conference room was enormous, with a long table surrounded by executives dressed in sharp suits. Mia counted at least a dozen people, each with a notepad or laptop in front of them. At the head of the table sat the CEO, an imposing man with silver hair and a measured expression. "Mrs. Carter," he began, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming. We've reviewed your emails and the incident report, and I want to personally apologize for what you and your son experienced." Mia shook his hand, but didn't let herself relax. She'd heard apologies before. What mattered now were actions. "Thank you," Maya replied, her voice steady. "I appreciate the apology, but I'm here because I want to make sure no other family has to go through what we did." The CEO gestured for her to sit, and Daniel took a seat nearby, ready to offer support if needed. As everyone settled in, the CEO nodded. "We're eager to hear your insights. Please, go ahead." Mia took a deep breath and began. "My son, Oliver, is 6 years old. He's autistic, which means he experiences the world differently. Noise, lights, and crowds can overwhelm him. Despite these challenges, he's a bright, loving child who deserves the same respect and understanding as any other passenger." She paused, looking around the room. Some executives nodded. Others avoided her gaze. "The treatment we received on your flight was unacceptable. But it's not just about my experience. After the incident, I connected with other parents and advocacy groups, and I've learned that stories like mine are far too common." Mia opened her tablet and projected a slide onto the room's large screen. It displayed statistics about families traveling with children on the autism spectrum and the challenges they faced. According to a recent study, Mia continued, 30% of families with autistic children avoid air travel altogether because of fear of judgment and mistreatment. That's not just a loss for those families. It's a loss for your business. Imagine how many customers you could retain if you made flying a more inclusive experience. She clicked to the next slide, which showcased testimonials from parents who had faced discrimination during air travel. The room was silent as the words of frustration and pain filled the screen. "Proposing a plan. I'm not here to just point out the problems," Maya said, breaking the silence. "I'm here to propose solutions." She pulled out a folder and distributed printed copies of her recommendations. "This is a multi-step plan to address the gaps in your current policies and training." Mia outlined her ideas. Comprehensive training programs. Your staff needs more than basic awareness training. They need in-depth education about autism and other disabilities. This should include role-playing exercises, sensitivity training, and guidance on how to de-escalate situations. Pre-flight accommodations. When families book tickets, they should have the option to notify the airline of any special needs. This information should be communicated to the crew before boarding. Sensory-friendly travel kits. Provide kits with noise-canceling headphones, sensory toys, and calming items for passengers who might benefit from them. Designated accessibility officers. Assign a trained staff member on every flight who can assist passengers with special needs and ensure they feel supported. Feedback loops. Create a system where passengers can share their experiences, both positive and negative, to help you continuously improve. Mia ended her presentation with a simple yet powerful statement. "This isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about setting a new industry standard. You have an opportunity to lead the way and show that inclusivity is not just a buzzword, but a commitment." The board reacts. The room remained quiet for a moment as the executives absorbed her words. Then the CEO leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Mrs. Carter, this is an impressive proposal. I can see you've put a great deal of thought into it." Mia nodded. "I have. This is my life. Every day, I advocate for my son and others like him. I want to work with you to make these changes a reality." One of the executives, a woman seated near the middle of the table, spoke up. "I think Mrs. Carter's point about pre-flight accommodations is particularly important. It's a small change, but it could make a significant difference for families." Another executive chimed in. "And the training programs. Those are essential. We can't expect our staff to handle these situations if we don't give them the tools." The CEO nodded, turning to Daniel. "Let's assemble a task force to review Mrs. Carter's recommendations and outline a plan for implementation. I want to see a pilot program in place within 6 months." Mia's heart lifted. She had expected resistance, but the board seemed genuinely receptive. Still, she wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. The personal touch. Before the meeting ended, the CEO addressed Mia directly. "Mrs. Carter, your passion and dedication are clear. We'd like to invite you to serve as a consultant during this process. Your insights will be invaluable as we work to improve." Mia hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. She hadn't expected to be asked to play such an active role. But as she looked around the room, She realized this was her chance to ensure the changes she envisioned would truly take shape. "I'd be honored," she said finally. "But my involvement comes with one condition. I want to see real, measurable progress. No empty promises." The CEO smiled. "You have my word." A step forward. As Maya left the meeting, Daniel walked her to the elevator. "You did incredible in there," he said. "I don't think they were expecting someone as prepared and passionate as you." Mia smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I'm glad they're willing to listen." Daniel nodded. "This is just the beginning, Mrs. Carter. The hard work starts now." As the elevator doors close, Mia allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had taken the first step in what would undoubtedly be a long journey. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope, not just for Oliver, but for all the families fighting the same battles. Her phone buzzed as she stepped outside. It was a message from the autism advocacy group she had connected with earlier. "Congratulations on the meeting. Let's discuss next steps soon. We're ready to help you make this a national movement." Mia smiled, her resolve strengthening. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't alone. And together, they would build a world where children like Oliver could thrive. Building a movement. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind for Mia. She had expected to feel relief after speaking with the airline's board. But instead, she felt a new urgency. The weight of the commitments made during the meeting hung heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't just about seeing the airline's promises come to fruition. It was about ensuring the movement she was starting had real momentum. Back home, Oliver was blissfully unaware of the storm Mia was navigating. He spent his days happily immersed in his favorite activities, playing with his dinosaur toys, drawing pictures of planes, and occasionally watching cartoons. Mia cherished those moments of peace with him, but she knew she couldn't slow down now. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and emails. Advocacy groups wanted to collaborate, journalists requested interviews, and families from across the country reached out to share their own stories. Each message was a reminder of why this fight was so important. Uniting voices. One evening, as Oliver slept soundly in his room, Mia sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a steaming cup of tea beside her. She was drafting an outline for the first meeting with the airline's newly formed task force. Her recommendations had been well received, but now she needed to ensure they were implemented effectively. Mia opened an email from the autism advocacy group she had partnered with. They had been working to compile additional data and stories to support her efforts. The subject line read, "Families ready to share their stories." She clicked it open and began reading. The stories poured in, heartbreaking, inspiring, and deeply personal. Parents described being judged by fellow passengers, ignored by airline staff, or outright denied the ability to board a flight with their children. Mia's chest tightened as she read. These were the voices she wanted to amplify. One story, in particular, stood out. A mother from Texas wrote about how her nonverbal daughter had been forced off a plane after a meltdown in the boarding area. The airline staff had refused to let them board, citing safety concerns. The mother described the humiliation and heartbreak of trying to explain her daughter's needs to people who simply didn't care. Mia wiped away a tear as she finished the email. She typed a quick response, thanking the woman for sharing her story and promising to include it in her presentation to the task force. This was exactly why she couldn't stop now. Collaborating for change. A week later, Mia joined her first virtual meeting with the airline's task force. The group included executives, trainers, and a few flight attendants who had been selected to provide frontline perspectives. Maya was heartened to see a representative from the autism advocacy group on the call as well. Daniel kicked off the meeting, his tone professional but encouraging. "Thank you all for joining us. As you know, this task force was created in response to feedback from Mrs. Carter, who is with us today. She's here to share her insights and help guide our efforts." Mia took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you for having me. I know this is just the beginning, but I want to commend you all for taking this step. The changes we're discussing have the potential to make a real difference, not just for families like mine, but for your entire customer base. She shared her screen and presented a detailed roadmap for implementing the recommendations she had outlined during her meeting with the board. Each step was accompanied by data, stories, and practical examples of how similar initiatives had succeeded in other industries. One of the flight attendants on the call, a woman named Sarah, spoke up. "Mrs. Carter, I've been a flight attendant for over 10 years, and I'll admit, we don't get much training on how to handle situations involving passengers with autism. Your son's experience is eye-opening for me. I want to learn how to do better." Mia smiled, her confidence growing. That's exactly the attitude we need. This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about equipping everyone with the tools to succeed. When your crew feels confident in handling these situations, passengers like my son will feel safer and more supported. The advocacy group representative chimed in. "We've developed training modules that can be adapted for the airline industry. They include sensory awareness strategies, communication techniques, and ways to create a more inclusive environment. We'd be happy to share these resources." The discussion was productive, and by the end of the meeting, Maya felt a sense of cautious optimism. The task force members seemed genuinely committed to the cause, and she could see the beginnings of a real plan taking shape. Expanding the mission. As the weeks went on, Mia's role as an advocate expanded beyond her wildest expectations. The airline's pilot program for autism awareness training launched successfully, and early feedback from participating crews was overwhelmingly positive. Flight attendants reported feeling more prepared and confident, and families traveling with special needs children noticed the difference. But Mia wasn't content to stop there. She began reaching out to other airlines, encouraging them to adopt similar programs. She hosted webinars, wrote opinion pieces for major newspapers, and even appeared on a morning talk show to discuss her journey. During one interview, the host asked her, "What drives you to keep pushing for change, even after the airline addressed your concerns?" Mia smiled, thinking of Oliver. This isn't just about one airline or one incident. It's about creating a world where children like my son are seen, understood, and supported. Every step we take brings us closer to that goal. Her story resonated with viewers, and soon, more airlines and businesses began reaching out, eager to learn how they could improve their policies. Maya found herself at the forefront of a growing movement. A personal milestone. One afternoon, Maya received an email from Daniel. It was an invitation to attend the first flight featuring the airline's fully trained crew under the new program. They wanted her and Oliver to be their honored guests. Mia hesitated. The thought of flying again stirred up memories of the traumatic experience that had sparked this journey. But as she looked at Oliver, now engrossed in building a Ligyo airplane, she realized this was an opportunity to show him how far they had come. "Oliver," she said gently, kneeling beside him, "how would you feel about going on an airplane again?" His eyes lit up with a mix of excitement and curiosity. "Will it be noisy?" "It might be," Mia admitted. "But this time, I think it'll be better. We'll bring your headphones and your toys, and we'll let the crew know what you need." Oliver nodded, his trust in her unwavering. "Okay, Mommy." The flight that changed everything again. On the day of the flight, Mia and Oliver arrived at the airport to a warm welcome. Daniel was there to greet them, along with several members of the task force. They walked Mia and Oliver through the newly implemented accommodations, including a dedicated check-in counter for families with special needs and a sensory-friendly waiting area. As they boarded the plane, the crew greeted them with genuine smiles. One flight attendant knelt to Oliver's level and said, "Hi, Oliver. I hear you love dinosaurs. Did you bring one with you today?" Oliver beamed, holding up his toy. "This is Rexy." "Well, Rexy is welcome on board too," the flight attendant said warmly. The flight itself was smooth, and for the first time, Mia felt completely at ease. Oliver remained calm and engaged, and the crew checked in with them periodically to ensure they had everything they needed. When the plane landed, Maya felt a wave of gratitude and pride. They had come full circle, from a harrowing experience to a hopeful new beginning. But she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. There were still more battles to fight, more barriers to break. As she and Oliver disembarked, she turned to Daniel. "Thank you for everything. But this is just the beginning." Daniel nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Mrs. Carter." Mia smiled, holding Oliver's hand tightly as they stepped into the terminal. The world still had a long way to go, but she was ready to keep pushing. One flight, one story, and one family at a time. A new horizon. Mia Carter had never imagined her life would take such a turn. What began as a harrowing experience on a flight had grown into a national movement, one that transcended her personal story. She had become a beacon of hope for families with children on the autism spectrum, an advocate whose voice carried weight in boardrooms and media outlets alike. Months after the launch of the airline's Autism Awareness Initiative, Maya found herself at the forefront of an even broader campaign. Her partnership with advocacy groups had expanded, and she was now working with policymakers to push for industry-wide standards in travel accommodations for individuals with disabilities. But despite her growing public profile, Mia never lost sight of what mattered most: Oliver. His resilience and joy continued to inspire her, grounding her in moments when the weight of her work felt overwhelming. Together, they had faced challenges that would have broken others. And now, they stood at the precipice of real, lasting change. A national summit. The culmination of Mia's efforts came when she was invited to speak at a national summit on accessibility and inclusion, hosted by a coalition of airlines, transportation companies, and advocacy groups. The summit was a groundbreaking event, bringing together industry leaders, policymakers, and families to discuss how to create a more inclusive travel experience for everyone. Mia was nervous as she stepped onto the stage. The room was filled with hundreds of attendees, and cameras streamed the event to thousands more watching online. She took a deep breath, clutching the edges of the podium as she began her speech. "Good morning," she started, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Mia Carter, and I'm here today because of my son, Oliver. He's 6 years old, and he's autistic. He experiences the world in ways that are both beautiful and challenging. And like any mother, all I want is for him to be treated with dignity and respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Earlier this year, my son and I boarded a flight that changed our lives. What should have been a routine journey turned into a moment of humiliation and judgment. But instead of letting that experience define us, I chose to turn it into an opportunity for change, not just for my family, but for every family like ours." Mia shared the progress they had made with the airlines program, highlighting the successes and lessons learned. But she also spoke candidly about the work that still needed to be done. "Inclusion isn't a box to check," she said. "It's a commitment, a mindset, and a way of approaching every decision with empathy and understanding. It's about creating systems that don't just accommodate people with disabilities, but embrace them as valuable members of our community." The room erupted in applause as she finished her speech. Maya felt a surge of pride, but she also knew this was just one step in a much larger journey. Unexpected allies. After the summit, Maya was approached by representatives from various industries, including hotel chains, car rental companies, and even theme parks. They wanted to know how they could implement similar programs to improve accessibility for their customers. It was overwhelming, but Maya saw it as a sign that the movement was growing. One particularly surprising ally emerged in the form of a retired airline executive named Frank Lawson. He had spent decades in the industry and admitted he had never fully understood the challenges faced by families like Mia's until he watched her speech. "Mrs. Carter," Frank said, shaking her hand firmly, "you've opened my eyes. I spent years focusing on numbers and logistics, but I realize now I overlooked something far more important: people. I'd like to help you bring this movement to more airlines. My experience might be useful." Mia welcomed his expertise, and together they began drafting a proposal to present to a consortium of airlines. The proposal included a standardized training program, pre-boarding accommodations, and a certification process for airlines that met certain accessibility criteria. A family's victory. While Maya's advocacy work gained traction, she also saw tangible improvements in her personal life. Traveling with Oliver became less daunting as the airline's new protocols took effect. On a recent trip, she noticed the changes immediately. A quiet boarding process, a designated staff member who introduced themselves as the accessibility officer, and a sensory-friendly kit waiting at their seat. Oliver, now more familiar with flying, handled the trip with remarkable ease. He even waved at the pilot as they boarded, a small gesture that brought tears to Maya's eyes. "Mommy, I like airplanes now," he said, clutching his toy dinosaur as he looked out the window. Mia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm so glad, sweetheart." The ripple effect. Maya's efforts began to inspire others to take action in their own communities. Schools, libraries, and public transportation systems started reaching out for guidance on creating autism-friendly environments. Families shared their gratitude for the changes they were seeing, and many credited Mia with giving them the courage to speak up about their own experiences. One email, in particular, stood out to Mia. It was from a father whose daughter had severe sensory sensitivities. He wrote about how her first flight, under the new program, had been a resounding success. "She told me it was like magic," the email read. "And for the first time, I felt like we weren't just passengers. We were people who mattered. Thank you for what you've done." Mia read the email aloud to Oliver, who grinned. "You're like a superhero, Mommy," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "No, buddy," she replied, hugging him tightly. "You're the superhero. I'm just following your lead." Legislation and legacy. Months later, Maya stood in front of Congress, testifying in support of a bill aimed at establishing national standards for accessibility in air travel. The bill, inspired in part by her work, proposed mandatory training for airline staff, accessible booking systems, and regular audits to ensure compliance. Mia spoke passionately, her words echoing through the chamber. "This isn't about special treatment. It's about equal treatment. It's about recognizing that people with disabilities aren't an afterthought. They're our neighbors, our friends, our children, and they deserve to be seen and supported." The bill passed with bipartisan support, a landmark victory that cemented Mia's legacy as a trailblazer for accessibility rights. A new chapter. Years later, Mia watched as Oliver, now a confident teenager, boarded a plane with ease. The changes she had fought for were now industry standards, and families across the country benefited from the work she had started. As the plane took off, Maya reflected on the journey they had taken together. What had once been a moment of despair had become the catalyst for a movement that changed lives. And while the road had been long and challenging, it had been worth every step. Sitting beside Oliver, she smiled as he leaned over to look out the window. "Mom," he said, his voice steady and full of excitement, "look how high we're flying." Mia nodded, her heart full. "Yes, sweetheart, we're flying higher than ever." Taking flight. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Mia couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed, not just for her and Oliver, but for countless families who had shared similar struggles. The journey to this moment had been filled with challenges, but it had also been deeply rewarding. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Oliver, now 14, sat beside her, flipping through a book about planes. He had developed a fascination with aviation, something Mia attributed to their many travels, and the changes that had made those experiences easier for him. He pointed out the window, his voice brimming with excitement. "Mom, do you think I could be a pilot one day?" he asked, his eyes sparkling. Mia's heart swelled. "Of course you can, sweetheart. You can do anything you set your mind to." Oliver grinned, turning back to his book, while Maya leaned back in her seat, reflecting on how far they had come. The final push for change. The next day, Mia arrived at her office, a small but bustling space she had rented to manage her advocacy work. The walls were adorned with framed articles, photos from her speaking engagements, and a map dotted with pins marking the cities she had visited. Each pin represented a step toward progress, a victory for the family she fought for. Her assistant, a young woman named Clara, greeted her with a stack of documents. "Morning, Mia. We've got updates from the airline consortium, and the education board wants your input on a new training curriculum." Mia smiled, taking the stack. "Let's tackle the consortium updates first. I want to make sure their training expansion is on track." Over the years, Mia's role had evolved. She was no longer just an advocate for air travel accessibility. She was a leader in a larger movement that spanned industries. Airlines, schools, hospitals, and even theme parks had adopted programs inspired by her efforts. She had also become a mentor to other parents, helping them navigate the complexities of advocating for their children. A letter that changed everything. Later that afternoon, Maya received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unassuming, but the return address caught her attention. It was from a family in a small Midwest town. She opened it carefully, unfolding the handwritten note inside. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I felt I had to write to you. My son, Ethan, is 8 years old and autistic. For years, we avoided traveling because it was just too hard. Too many stairs, too much judgment. But last month, we decided to take a chance and fly to visit family. I want you to know that it was the best experience we've ever had." The crew was kind and understanding. They gave Ethan a sensory kit and let us board early. For the first time, I felt like we were treated as people, not problems. "I know this wouldn't have happened without you. Thank you for fighting for families like mine. You've given us a gift we'll never forget. Sincerely, Emily Green." Mia felt tears welling up as she read the letter. It wasn't the first time she had received such a note, but each one reminded her why she had started this journey. She carefully placed the letter in a folder labeled Inspiration, which she kept on her desk for moments when the work felt overwhelming. The legacy of change. In the years that followed, Maya's advocacy work continued to flourish. The airline industry adopted universal accessibility standards, ensuring that every airline provided comprehensive training, pre-flight accommodations, and sensory-friendly options. Her work even inspired international carriers to follow suit, making air travel more inclusive on a global scale. Mia also helped establish a foundation in Oliver's name, dedicated to supporting families with autistic children. The foundation provided grants for therapy, education, and travel, giving families opportunities they might not have had otherwise. Oliver, now a young adult, pursued his dream of aviation. With the right support and accommodations, he earned his private pilot's license and began working toward becoming a commercial pilot. Mia often joked that one day she would be flying on a plane with her son at the controls. The final flight. Years later, Mia sat on a plane bound for a conference in Washington, D.C. This time, she wasn't alone. Oliver was in the cockpit, serving as the co-pilot for the flight. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot, Oliver Carter. I'd like to welcome you aboard and let you know that today's flight is extra special. My mother, Mia Carter, is with us. Her work to make air travel accessible to everyone made it possible for me to be here today. So, Mom, this flight's for you." Mia's eyes filled with tears as the cabin erupted in applause. She looked out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly around her, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her journey had been long and challenging, but it had led to a world where children like Oliver could dream, thrive, and soar, literally and figuratively. As the plane carried her forward, she knew that the legacy she had built would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as she leaned back in her seat, listening to the hum of the engines, Mia allowed herself to relax, knowing that her fight had made the world a better place.